This is Critical Nonsense, our high-low browser about culture, science, and tech. This week, Jess and Joey talk about tools?
Woo! Do you remember? This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer, and she's bad, Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. It's the 26th of March as we record this.
I love it. Timestamp. Housekeeping. Recently, an article came out earlier this week. This is the 26th of March. It came out the 25th of March about our company, Sylvain, over the past 18 months and how we managed the loss of our friend and co-founder, Alain Sylvain. And it's a nice piece. It is worth a read, I think. Maybe we would tell the story a little bit differently in the ways that, you know, when you're reading your own story, you have to sort of meld the way that someone else understands your narrative with your own. But I think it's a really nice piece. It's in Inc. magazine. We'll share the link in the show notes. And take a look if you want to know more about us, I guess.
Yeah.
Jess.
Joey.
With that, we had a conversation before the show started and we determined, hey, maybe this is actually the thing that we should talk about instead of those other things.
Right.
All of those other things, that long list of many things. So do you want to prime this?
Tools. We were talking about the trade-offs of having tools that maybe create assumptions for the user and almost give permission for us not to think about the limitations of that tool. I just had an experience in the last 24 hours of using a tool built for our use internally, and I misused that tool as an inexperienced tool user and found myself thinking, well, you know, if I'd used my brain, maybe I would have realized my error. I would have picked up on this thing, but instead I put so much faith in the tool that I didn't think twice. And at the same time, I am a super tool lover. I love having sort of codified processes and structures that make things more efficient, and feel like this is an interesting topic, talking to you as someone who, maybe famously is sort of tool averse. And in this moment of vulnerability, as I am also questioning this sort of perception I have, or the value that I put in tools, I guess I'm wondering, Joey, when do we tool or not tool? To tool or not to tool?
That is the question. One, I find it hilarious you saying that I'm famously tool averse.
Would you not agree?
I don't know. This is not a thing that I've ever considered. I don't know that is true. I think my aversion is to sort of rules that mandate a specific tool in a specific moment. I like having the flexibility of many tools, and sometimes, even when I'm fixing something at my house, like oftentimes I'm using the wrong tool for the job because it works in the narrow context that I actually need the tool to work, right? It doesn't fit around a corner, but I can use pliers instead of a crescent wrench because I can actually get a grip in a way when I can't see the fitting to perfectly go around. An arbitrarily made up example, but I think that idea of having flexibility and options is actually like what I probably overly romanticize, I think, because I don't like being delimited in a predetermined way.
Yeah, you are also famously rule averse, and constraint averse, because then your hand is forced and whatever. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think there is sort of the inherent why before the tool, right? Like, what are you trying to accomplish, and why this tool over why this tool? Is there another thing that would work just as well to achieve the same ends? And I think it probably comes back to some of the conversations we've had about also getting too infatuated by metrics and certain measurement. It's the same thing, right? Where you can get distracted from what actually is the thing. And then you might look for different solutions. It is that sort of famously quoted, if you have a hammer, then everything starts looking like a nail. Oh no, if this is the only tool you have, are those the only solutions that you feel comfortable coming up with? But then there's also, I think there's also just an interesting thing that comes of what kind of assumptions and safety that we derive from having tools. Like, there is a discomfort that can happen when you kind of like when you walk out of the house without anything, like you don't have your phone, you don't have your wallet. It's just like, whew, it's just me in the world. Like, I've got nothing on me. Like, I wonder, is there a part of this for you that is the exhilaration of having to figure it all out with nothing to rely on?
I definitely like that exercise. Like, I will fully admit, like, the number of things, we've talked about this probably at some point. Like, I keep these random bits of stuff at my house. I think partially of an impulse for conservation, of like, just in case, I don't know, maybe growing up without money, you're like, well, don't throw it away.
Maybe I'll use that.
That random set of screws that were extra in this flat pack could be used somewhere else.
I have a whole box of IKEA extras of all the things from IKEA furniture that all belongs in the same place.
But then I find these instances where it's like, this thing is broken, but I do have a random nut that fits this situation that I can fix this thing. I think there is. Let me give you a few examples of things that I've heard recently. So I was talking to someone, an executive at a company that had a big internal operations software contract, right? They spent millions of dollars on this software contract to help them with internal resourcing and things like that. And the tool in theory is supposed to be semi-automatic, fill in the blanks to reduce work and be more efficient for everybody. It's so complicated that people can't use it, and they've defaulted to just using Excel sheets, right? And so there is a component of that where you think you're finding the most perfectly built tool specific for this, but then becomes really inflexible for the day-to-day utility. Similarly, there's this meme that goes around every once in a while about this big shipping company had an engine break, and all of their team couldn't figure it out, and they bring in this guy who is very experienced in it. And this probably comes from a kernel of truth, an actual thing that happened, but it gets manipulated over time. And he comes in and he looks at it for a while, and he bangs something with a hammer 3 times, and the engine starts working again. And sends the company the invoice, and it's $10,000. And the executive is like, $10,000? You banged it with a hammer? And he's like, can you itemize this? And he's like, $2 banging with a hammer, $9,998 knowing where to bang. And that idea of sometimes it doesn't require the really complicated tool, that you can just every time I MacGyver a solution in my home, I get so much satisfaction out of it. I use leftover air conditioner ducting, and then I used some duct tape and some string, and now this thing is mounted and situated perfectly. I had the super in our building come to my apartment recently, and as he was leaving, he had to help us with a plumbing thing real quick. And as he was leaving, he looked at like my door and is like, why is this like this? And I was like, it works. And I just had like duct taped this thing so I didn't have to mess with one of the and he's like, how long has it been like this? I was like, since I moved in. and he's like, I could fix this. I was like, I didn't know, but it works now, so it's fine. So I think there is like a joy of, but it requires then in all of those instances of just like having some demand on cognitive load, of being the engineer that like knows like actually this part just gets stuck. Like that's all it is. And like bang 3 times on the side of an engine and it works. Is like you need to be able to like think about the place where you're using the tool. And I think what you mentioned was in some instances you're trying to create tools to avoid thinking, but like if you don't understand how it works, then you can't operate when the tool is not there. And I think some of this is actually like what people are starting to talk about being worried about with LLMs and AI, where like new CS students coming out of college are like, I can build stuff using like generative AI tools for coding, but then they like don't actually understand the systems architecture. So if something breaks, they can't even identify what's broken to fix it.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, or at least, I mean, it's interesting. There's 2 parts to this. There's like the seemingly every generational fear that the next generation will lose all skill set. Like when calculators came out, people were like, no one's gonna do math. And they were like a little right, but also a little bit overly concerned about the like what happens if you don't have a calculator, because now calculators
the inherent
are everything.
merit of doing math.
Yeah, exactly. But it's funny on the second thing, Ryan and I were having a conversation the other day about AI and how he was like, people need to understand that when you use AI, you should think of it like the genie that grants your wishes very literally, of like, hey, I'm looking for a picture of, I don't know, a hamster who's really proud of himself at work. And it's like, sure, but you didn't specify what kind of hamster. Like maybe this is the hamster is actually the devil, and his job is like sending people to the underworld, and he's loving it. And
he's good at his job.
You're like, God, that actually does technically fit the description, but I did not specify. And suddenly
we got dark. Yeah.
And I think there's something really funny about that, of like, you certainly learn when you use some AI tools, you get that very quickly. You understand its limitations every time you interact with it, of like, fair, that is a way to respond to the thing that I was asking, but I didn't ask it quite so. And it's funny because once you understand that about it, that's part of the training of how to use the tool, right? And then you start to use it better. You know what it can do, you know what it can't do, and you sort of can put it in that place. I think the trouble is when we judge a tool or we use it without that critical thinking. Like, sure, I need whatever, and you copy paste that hamster devil story into something and assume that it's all going to turn out okay, when the whole prompt for your creative writing class was talking about Timothy the hamster. Anyway, this has gone off the rails. You get the idea.
Yeah, no, I get the idea. I mean, I think it is like that Carl Sagan quote of like, when you're trying to learn new tools, it's like, in order to create an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. Like, there is like, what are the components that you're taking for granted because you already sort of inherently understand them? And I think using an LLM is like a good example of what are you taking for granted because you are using this like perfectly naive entity agent that is like brilliantly intelligent and completely disconnected from the reality that you exist in the same way, I mentioned in talking about the sort of pricing tool that you were using, where it's like, I often don't think about these things because I'm taking them for granted because I've been doing this longer than you. And so there's all these like little instances where you figure a thing out and you don't even realize that, like, you know, you've shifted your mental model. And so someone's like, how do you use this? It's like, oh, you just like,
you
poke
know,
it,
you use it.
You hit it 3 times with a hammer and it's fine. You know, like,
yeah,
and
exactly.
Like, where, you know?
Okay. What's funny though, is like, we're talking in this context, you know, the inspiration for this conversation is a complicated tool. AI is a supremely complicated tool. What's funny is on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are no guises around like what a banana slicer is for. That is the most simple, foolishly single-use appliance. Have you ever seen one of those? It's like it is basically like a banana-shaped, typically plastic, maybe metal, and to be clear, banana-shaped of like the specific orientation of the banana too. It has to be like laying down on its side, such that you can create perfect sort of coins in one fell swoop. It is one of the most crazy single-use kitchen appliances because first of all, most people who eat bananas probably are just eating them in their hand. Like even a kid might just be able to just have it and need not slice. But let's say you're a big banana slicer and you need to have your perfectly, you know, half-inch spaced coins. Like, great, this will work for you. And no one is ever wondering, like, you know, I guess like I never know how to use a knife again to cut a banana because this is the only way.
Yep.
Like, obviously it's not going to happen. And I feel like a similar analogy is we probably can worry much less around simpler tools. It's the complex tools that are easier to go wrong, and B, easier for us to assume that it is smarter than us when really it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about the simplicity of a tool and that, you know, like even you're like, the banana slicer is only used for this. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, what else?
But what else could it be used for?
Maybe it could be used for cutting
Play-Doh.
gnocchi.
Yeah. Okay,
like,
sure. Fine.
But yeah, but it is so simple that it allows different utility, whereas complex or complicated, distinguishing those two things, have a level of precision for the specific utility that you want to use them for. But there's a point too of we were talking about ahead of the show of like, if you don't know how to use it, in some instances, that's a sign you shouldn't be using it, right? Like, and I don't think that's true of every tool, but like, you know, an arc welder. I don't know how to use an arc welder because I shouldn't be using an arc welder.
But so I think this is the thing, right? There are two components to this. There is the expertise of the individual, and then there is the specificity of the tool. There are certain things like a spoon, like a screwdriver, where it is such a well-built tool that it can be used with very little individual expertise. There are other tools that were so purpose-built, they were maybe unhygienically built. Like, this is a thing that's very commonly associated with like poorly built Excel spreadsheets, right? Of like, well, you really have to have a high amount of expertise. Maybe you have to be the one who built it to know how to use this tool properly because of how complex of a tool it is and how single purpose it is. Even though it's built with a lot of bells and whistles. Like I guess I would argue maybe even going back on how I described the banana slicer, like maybe that is actually like a middle range complexity tool, but you can largely like figure out what it's meant to be for versus like the black hole of
a stick.
Right. Like there's like a perfect, that is like, there's no wrong way. However you want to use that, like the worst case is that you literally break the stick and then maybe you find another stick. But yeah, and I feel like what is really critical is having an awareness of your own level of expertise and the tool's complexity. It is the biggest trap to assume that you do not need very much expertise and that this tool is a simple one, when in fact, it is precisely the opposite. It requires much more individual expertise and the tool is way more complicated than it looks.
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing is like simplicity allows for flexibility. Complex requires precision.
Right.
And if you miss that mark, you get into complicated, right? Like complicated is like the Rube Goldberg machine is complicated, right? Whereas like
more possibility for error.
Yeah, you
at any step.
Yeah, you want to be like having that downward pressure towards simplicity, but certain challenges require and have an amount of complexity that requires like additional steps or greater understanding or more precision in order to be able to do this multi-step process. But like complication is the pitfall.
That's right.
Like that, arguably the banana slicer is like too complex for its own, or too complicated for its own good.
That's right.
Like
for how simple it is.
You had the knife, like the knife was perfectly adequate.
Or even like it is so simple but deceivingly so that you don't realize that it could be used for Play-Doh, that it could be used for anything else, because it's like, well, it's shaped like a banana, so that is the only way that I can possibly use this tool.
Gnocchi, mochi, tanuin, there are other gelatinous things that you need of a certain size.
Put the squishy thing and squish it, and then
well, Jess, I think this brings us to our favorite tool, the wrap-up corner.
Wow, thank you so much. It seems like what we're aligning on are that there are kind of two steps. The first one is to figure out what kind of tool you have on your hands. Is it a really complicated tool, or is it a really simple tool? And if you have any control over it, can you make it a simple tool? Because there will be less room for user error with a simpler tool. Let's try to make it a spoon. But let's say it's not a spoon. Let's say it's some kind of AI spinning a yarn about a hamster who's secretly the devil. Then look to your own individual expertise and figure out, okay, what kind of training do I need to be able to measure up to this tool and use it safely without hitting barriers of my own expectation or assumption, or the limitations of the tool's own capabilities. That's where you can get yourself in trouble. So here for spoons?
Yeah. And Alex, if we still have the hamster hands song,
1-800-HAMSTER-HAMS. Get your hams today.
I hope that's stuck in your head the rest of the day, because it's going to be stuck in mine. Thanks, Cards for Kids. And thanks, Jess, for wrapping up the tools. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by... Yeah, I guess that works.
We'd like to thank executive producer and Velcro, Jess Vander.
Oh my gosh, that is such a compliment. We'd also like to thank sound engineer and multi-tool, Alex Contel.
We'd like to thank programming coordinator and the duct tape of this show, Les Jacobs.
That's actually true. And also extended universe of duct tape. Thank you to our production crew, Sarah Gilbert, Nora Mestrich, Christy Jensen, Amanda Medina, and Amy Waters.
And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Thanks.
Special thanks. Duct tape. Great tool.
Like really, really, really great.
Reinforced, one side smooth, one side sticky. What can you do with it?
What can't you do with it? I'd also like to thank cyanoacrylate glue. Super glue really takes you far place. It's really helpful. Dries quick. You know what else? Speaking of adhesives, I'd actually like to thank Clear Nail Polish. Clear Nail Polish, the essential tool in many women's handbags that really comes in handy when you least expect it.
Literally. I'd also like to thank... I'd like to thank Flex Seal, because I want to use it. That commercial. I want to
try it.
Punch a hole in a 50-gallon drum, and then it starts spilling out, and then just slap it with the Flex Seal.
Can we just talk again about all of those infomercials for the same thing? It's like sometimes it's a home utility by the same guy who brought us OxyClean, and then sometimes it's like a children's toy. Like, do you remember that thing where you would like blow bubbles into what I'm sure is some kind of plastic, and it would create like a perma bubble?
Yeah.
It's like, wow, what can't we do?
Glue bubbles. We can have glue bubbles. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
We did it.
Okay. Well,
thanks, Flex Seal. Love you, mean it. Bye.
Bye.
1-800-HAMSTER-HAMS. Get your hams today.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sean, and we, over at Hamster Hams, have the best honey-glazed hamster hams that you've ever looked for this Easter season.
Oh, sure, you've heard of pig ham. Boring.
Womp womp and gerbil ham, forget that.
No time.
But hamster hams.
Oh, that tender hamster meat just rolling off the bone.
It's so tangy and twingy.
Can you taste the tang?
And don't forget the side of coleslaw.
It may take a lot of hamsters to get these hams, but you're gonna love them. Can we have hamster hams for dinner? Kids love hamster hams.
I'd really like a hamster ham. Uncle Charlie, stop it.
1-800-HAMSTER-HAMS. Get your hams today.